Well, welcome everybody to the Young Man's Guide to Life. My name is Andrew, and I am the host of this podcast for our young adult community here at Renewed Church. Now, I have the privilege and the honor today to have a really special guest with me here in studio. Everybody, this is Lee Becker, Mr. Becker.
That's it. Hello.
Known as Mr. Becker my whole life. Lee Becker is a high school teacher at Meadowvale Secondary School, still teaching mostly English.
Mostly English, yeah.
And Lee Becker, or Mr. Becker to me, was my high school English teacher. I think I had you for two.
I think in grade 10 and grade 12.
That's right. Yeah. And I always remember Mr. Becker, Lee Becker, as being somebody who connected really well with students. I always remember him as not putting up with any bullcrap from anybody. And I know what that's like now as an adult who's 300 pounds. Like, you don't feel like you have to put up with anything from anybody. No. It's actually part of why I got the job as a youth pastor, was because you can beat up all the kids. So be the guy who beats. So
I remember my first year at Meadowvale, I had a student who basically told me that I was intimidated by him. And I remember in my head laughing so hard at the idea that there was a 17-year-old on earth that intimidated me.
Right, yeah. And so what's also interesting about Mr. Becker's life is that we've maintained contact, and I've been able to see some of the stuff that he's been involved in. We've maintained conversation over the years, and we actually got together, what was it, a year and a half ago?
Right about a year and a half ago.
Pretty close to when COVID hit, but a little bit before that. And we actually talked about like trying to figure out how to serve the youth community together, because I was serving a lot of students that went to Meadowvale School. You were obviously doing that as a teacher, and we kind of shared values and shared passions and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
About a lot of things. And so this has kind of been an ongoing thing, and it's just super cool to have this conversation now in person in a podcast, and doing it for our students in our youth program, doing it for the parents of students,
for sure,
and then also doing it for our young adults, because you have seen kind of a few waves of young adults graduate high school.
I'm almost old enough now where former students' kids will be in my class, which is wild to think about. Right?
Nuts to think about.
Absolutely.
Anybody who's watching from my graduation year is going to be shocked by that, and they're going to feel really awkward about where they're at in life. They're going to be like, wait a sec, that's how old I am?
Yeah. We were talking today, and it's been, my first school year was 2002, 2003.
Wow.
So we're getting close to the 20-year mark now, which is wild.
Just wild. And I was actually telling somebody, because someone was like, okay, so who's this Mr. Becker guy? And I'm like, he's a high school teacher at Meadowvale Secondary School, but people who live in Meadowvale, most of them, if they've lived there for the same amount of time you've taught there, would know you, because either they went to Meadowvale Secondary School and had you as a teacher, or their kids are going to Meadowvale Secondary School or went there and had you as a teacher. And you were pretty well known as a teacher in Meadowvale. You had an ability to connect with students in a unique way, in a personal way. Like I said earlier, people looked up to you, respected you. You kind of were able to engage students at a different level than a lot of teachers, less the teacher and student model, and more relationally and friendship-wise, and connect with them outside in sports and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think some of that comes from my own experience in high school, where it took me 6 years to graduate. I wasn't the ideal high school student. I had a few teachers who kind of steered me in the right direction. And I've always felt that kind of responsibility to those people more than a responsibility to the institution of education, if that makes sense. So it's always been more, I had those relational kind of relationships with some teachers, and I feel like it's my job to do that as well.
I think you're doing an excellent job of it. And I have had students who have graduated over the years from Meadowvale Secondary School, and you're the teacher that sticks out. They remember that.
I appreciate that.
And so it's effective, and we appreciate that you have that value. So that's good. I remember two main things from English class with Mr. Becker. One was Trogdor.
Trogdor the Burninator. Yeah.
So if you ever hear me say that, that's a Becker reference.
Yeah, from homestarrunner.com.
That's right. And if it don't make money, it don't make sense.
It's true. If it don't make money, it don't make sense. I learned that when I was working in a bar in Halifax, and there was an older gentleman named Joey Sr., and his son Joey Jr. worked with us as well, and that was Joey Sr. would constantly tell us, if it don't make money, it don't make sense.
That's awesome.
And that was it. Yeah, absolutely.
Just live with me. So I know that there's some people who are going to watch this who are going to be like, what? Mr. Becker's on a podcast with Andrew. What is his life like? So why don't you tell us? Because when I was in high school, you had just had your daughter, Stella. And so parenthood was new to you, and a lot of your references you made, especially in grade 12 year, were to parenthood. And then a lot of people lost touch or connection, may not be aware of where you're at and what your life looks like now. So why don't you tell people?
Sure. So I have two kids now. I have my daughter, Stella, who's 13, that we talked about, and I vividly remember bringing her to a basketball game when she was just brand new. And and a group of girls, took care of her in the stands while I was coaching. My wife was there, and they loved it, and it was fantastic. And now she's almost ready to go to high school. She's going through the process of picking her courses. So that's a surreal thing for sure. And then my son Judah's 9, so he's halfway through elementary school and making a push towards becoming like he's almost into double digits, and he's pretty psyched about that. You know? So he's like we call him old man kid, because he very much has some tendencies that are like grumpy old manish in a 9-year-old body.
Where did you get that from, you or your wife?
You know what? I don't know. I think like my wife is more level, but she's Irish and Italian, right? Okay. So it's like, long memory, short fuse a little bit. And
as level as you can be.
Right. I'm more chill, but I'm snappier, if that makes sense. So she's like a slow burn, and then you're in trouble. And I'm like even keel, and then I lose it. And then so he's more like he's like a grouchy old man sometimes, but it's really funny. Like the way that he's a grouchy old man is hilarious. His delivery is on point.
Yeah.
Very sarcastic, absolutely, and very sarcastic and hilarious. So we have fun. Like most people are mad about being stuck at home for the last year, and I'm loving it. We have a blast. So,
that's fun.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's really fun. And so you're still living in Kitchener. Yeah. Are you still? You were saying we always knew you played football. You coached a football team. You were coaching adults too. Like, where are you at with football?
So I stopped playing in 2011. I had the pleasure of having 5 concussions in a calendar year.
Yikes!
So that basically ended.
Glad you're still here.
Yeah,
Yikes.
Me too. And then. So I coached until about 2016, 2018, somewhere in that range. I'm trying to remember which year it was, but I had a lot of concussions. So I coached men until I think about 2018 on the team that I used to play for, and then now I just coach high school. So
with obviously at
Meadowville, yeah. Cool. For a while I was coaching 3 teams. So I was coaching the Cambridge Lions varsity team, and then Meadowville, and also coaching the Tri-City Outlaws men's team that I used to play for. So now just high school.
Dang. So I got to ask you the question, your favorite high school graduation year of students you've taught.
Wow.
What is it?
I have to, I'm going to go with the ones that I taught when they were in grade 8.
Yeah.
So before I was at Meadowville, I had the pleasure of teaching at Lisgar and Edenwood. So I was at Edenwood for about a month as a daily supply teacher, and then I was at Lisgar for about 6 months.
And that was in the 2002, 2003?
So no, that was after that. So I taught in 2002, 2003 is when I was in the Northwest Territories.
Oh, right. That's right.
And then 2003, 2004 is when I was doing grade 8 stuff. Okay. And then 04, 05 was my first year at Meadowvale.
Okay.
So it would have been those kids. So they're, I think, a couple years older than you, but not tons older than you.
Yeah, like my brother's age.
Yeah. Like those kids were
89 to 90.
Yeah, I think if I had to pick favorites, which I don't really want to do, because all the thousands of kids I've taught are special in their own way. But I think it's that first group, just because I got to see them, when they were in grade 8, right? And then to see those kids grow up, and now they're in their early 30s, which is pretty nuts, right? So yeah, that's a neat group of kids. I had grade 12s my first year at Meadowville too, who were fantastic. Yeah, and they're like 34 now, which is way older than I was when I was their teacher.
Yeah, so that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's wild.
Yeah.
What I wanted to do is spend some time talking a little bit about a few things. I want to talk about youth culture today and how you've seen it change and shift. Obviously, technology has had a huge play on that. Obviously, just culture in general and the cultural waters we're all swimming in has had to play on that. So I want you to be able to maybe articulate and define differences in youth culture from, say 12 years ago when I was a high school student to what it's like today. And I think that's helpful for students to know things haven't always been the way they are. No, people don't always interact the way that they have interacted, and that there's outside forces that are imposed on them that lead to cultural shifts. It helps parents think about their students differently. For sure. I feel like a lot of parents struggle with when I was in high school, everything was fine. What was your problem, dude? And it's like, no, things change.
Things are very different.
And so being able to define some of the cultural shifts that you've noticed, maybe pinpoint a couple of things that you think contribute to that, and then push a little bit into one of the major differences is levels of anxiety amongst students. So we can press into that kind of after we talk about some of the cultural stuff. So define some of the different cultural aspects of youth culture today that you notice.
So the one thing I think is, and it's really very different from when I was a teenager. So I was a teenager in the 90s, and I get laughs a lot talking about how my first email address I got in my first year of university. Right. So I went through 6 years of high school without an email address, which is incredible when you think of today, right? My 9-year-old has multiple email addresses.
And doesn't want to use any of them.
No, not at all, right? So
because they're so archaic.
Email was a thing that I really didn't get into until probably my second year. And in my first year of university is when I had my first email address, right? So When I was in high school, music wasn't disposable either.
True.
So music was really expensive. Like we would spend $17 or $18 back when minimum wage was $7 or $6.85 or whatever. So you ended up having to dress like the music that you listened to.
Because you only had so much music to listen to, so you had to pick.
Right. So if you wanted to get music, you had to sort of wear a uniform that said, "This is the music that I listen to,"
right?
And then you could trade music with other people. And I remember there's a guy, Brian Bernard, who I still talk to today, who we didn't hang out in the same groups, but we listened to the same kind of music. So we would meet in the stairwell and we would exchange, and it was like very shady, right? Like this, we'd both leave to go to the washroom at the same time from different classes, and we'd meet in the stairwell and we'd swap CDs. And that was kind of how you ended up defining yourself as a person, was based on the music that you listened to. And then when I was teaching at Meadowvale, that was when iPods became a thing, right? And it was still back in the LimeWire days and the tail end of Napster, right? So then all of a sudden music became completely disposable. So now it's really interesting to see. I remember a time at Meadowvale where I used to I would grab kids' iPods and I would go through their playlists. And I
remember that. You would be able to talk about them and know something about them from that.
Right, and I'd be blown away by the variety of music, right? So now that's one thing where you can't look at a kid anymore and be like, they listen to this music.
Right.
Because when you would open up their iPod, you would find that there was an incredible range of music. And it's like my 9-year-old, he has like a 4-hour-long Spotify playlist that he's picked the music for. And when you look at it, it's everything from like the Backstreet Boys to AC/DC to all this massive variety of music, right? So that's one huge societal shift, is you don't see kids broadcasting what they're into. Kids basically now sort of dress the same, if that makes sense. There's not really the uniforms that we had and like the clearly defined subcultures.
Right.
I mean, then I think everything becomes now, it would be ridiculous for us to not acknowledge the effect of having all the information in the world right at your fingertips, and how when that came out, when we were really talking about the internet in its infancy in the 90s, it was this mind-blowing idea that you could look at anything that humans had ever recorded. And now we figured that we have all access to everything, and our focus is on like memes, right? So we've gone like full circle back to like, basically jokes, right? So it's so strange to see that, right? So
how have you seen that impact your authority as a teacher? Because I feel like as a pastor, that impacts your authority, because any student anywhere can just Google something that can that they believe might be making you look wrong or dumb or tear down your authority or question your authority or integrity, right? And
so
have you noticed?
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you're saying. And I think that's a thing. And I think what's happened now is because we have access to so much information, we immediately tend to believe that the first thing that we read is the truth, right? So before, I talked about how I wasn't a good high school student. So I used to skip school and go to the library, which is bizarre, right? I would not go to school, and instead I would lock myself in a study carrel in the library, and I'd listen to music and I'd read books. But I would go down these weird kind of rabbit holes where I would get all the books on this subject, and I'd spend like 4 days reading them. And now what happens, I think, is we have such a monumental access to information that we don't really go deep anymore. So we kind of find something that we latch onto, and then it's really easy to find other sources that back up what you're saying, right? So if you look at now, with everything, we have all these bizarre conspiracy theories. But there's all kinds of information that appears to back up what you're saying.
Well, and the algorithms are made to keep you clicking. And so Facebook and YouTube want you to click down the basic rabbit trail and not expose you to other content that
absolutely. It's a running joke between my wife and I, because we have a Google like Nest or whatever it's called, one of those little things that I got for free, right? So a company's willing to send me technology now because it's so and of course we're like, oh, this seems like a great idea, but it's obviously so they can spy on me, right? So I'm always amazed where I'll have a conversation and then I'll open Instagram and there'll be 15, like I was talking about vermiculture. So I have a backyard food garden. And there's like vermiculture where you use worms to do, to get you good soil. So now whenever I open Instagram after this conversation, there's this book. It's called Me and Worms, which is like a guide to vermiculture that comes up. Like, I'm really not that into it, where I need to see books on it every waking hour.
If I wanted a book on it, I would go to Amazon and look for a book on it.
Exactly, right? It's not really the focus of my life, but my social media platforms seem to believe that all I'm interested in.
What are the odds, though, you end up buying the book?
Oh, I'm probably going to have to buy the book, because the ad that they keep sending me is for like a really good book on it. It's like the ultimate guide to vermiculture. permaculture.
Right.
So
you're like, I could use it.
Yeah. So it's bizarre, right?
Yeah, it is.
My brother lives in Winnipeg, and he is the king of the random Amazon purchase.
Oh, yeah.
So he works weird hours because he works in IT. And he'll message me and he'll be like, I just bought a grappling hook. He's like, I got an ad for a grappling hook. I've wanted a grappling hook my whole life. And I'm like, are you Batman? Like what
Right.
what is the purpose of a grappling hook? So yeah, that part of it is really interesting. This idea that even though we have all the information, we can still pick and choose what we choose to look at, right? And I think I don't have too big of a problem with kids really saying you're wrong. And I'm not, like I always say, like, if I have to go to work and fight with 17-year-olds all day long, then clearly I'm not doing my job right. Right? Like, this is what I know. And I think in education, we're getting away from the idea. Like when I started teaching, I would say, I don't really know this book. People would say, well, just fake it, right? Like they don't know that you don't know.
True.
And I think we're kind of getting away from that now. And we're more into showing people how to use all that information that's available to them and to discern what's a good source and what's a bad source. And we're less away from the idea that I'm going to take these 10 points and stick them in your head so that when you leave, it'll be there, right? Now it's more, you learn to navigate so you can find 10 good points when you need them, as opposed to trying to just cram everything into your head, right?
Right.
So I think that's changed dramatically since I started
Interesting.
teaching.
So you're basically trying to train them to think critically instead of memorize information, which I have found that shift. I've experienced that shift, right? I don't want our students just to listen to me and believe what I tell them anymore, because I find that to be useless, because they'll just find somebody else who they respect or trust more.
Right.
I want you to think critically about it. And if I can train you to think critically about it, then hopefully you'll arrive at truth more often than falsehood, right?
Right, and one of the big things we struggle with right now in English is there's really not a right answer in English.
Right.
So it's not like math where, 2 + 2 is 4, and that's kind of indisputable, right? Whereas in English, I'm rarely looking for a specific answer. I'm looking for that student's answer. So we're having a really hard time right now having kids to have the confidence to say, this is what I believe because of this, this, and this, where we still have students that are looking for the answer that they think I want them to give me, right? In the grand scheme of things, I've read, like right now I'm teaching Twelfth Night. I've read Twelfth Night a million times. I've taught Twelfth Night a million times. Like, Shakespeare's 500 years old. So I'm not looking for a specific answer. I want to know, like, what do you think about this character, and tell me why you think that. And that seems to be a struggle right now, is having kids to have the confidence to say, this is what I believe in because.
Yeah. So, well, one of the things we talked about before was anxiety in students today. And that sounds like it would be a nightmare for a student who struggles with anxiety and lacks confidence. And what we talked about before was just seeing, you've noted, and I can't really note this because I can't really, maybe self-diagnose my own generation.
Sure.
But you can diagnose it as an objective observer, the differences in students' anxiety in high school. And you were saying it's
definitely
way different.
It's through the roof, right? So what I'm finding anyways, I don't want to speak for every teacher, but what I'm finding right now is that there's a lot more anxiety about marks, and a lot of that anxiety is unnecessary, right? So I have probably an undiagnosed anxiety disorder as well, and we talked about that, right? How I get very freaked out by things that I know are irrational. So I'll say, okay, I have no reason to be this nervous, and then I go through every scenario. But what we're finding right now with students is that kids have an unrealistic idea of the marks that they need to get to the next level of education. So I'll have kids that don't know what they want to do when they go to university or college, but they're convinced that if they don't have a 97, they're going to die in a ditch. Right. And I'm trying to get them to understand that, you can have a 78 and still have a very successful life, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, kids in grade 9 I was talking about who think that their life is over if they get an A that's not a high enough A. So when you were in school, an 80 was still a good mark, right?
Yeah.
Where now I'm finding kids are losing their mind about an 80, and they're saying, oh, that's a bad mark, I'm not going to be. And I'm like, that's an A. Like, you have an A.
Right.
Like,
you're going to be high.
It's good, yeah. So that thing right there, this idea that there's so much and we hear parents say it all the time, well, it's way more competitive right now, and it's really not, right? Like, there's 35 to 40 universities in the country, and the nice thing about Canada is that any university or college that you go to here is a pretty good school. It's not like in other countries where there's a massive drop between the quality of education you'll get at one school to another.
Right.
For the most part here, because of our accreditation process, most post-secondary schools that you go to are kind of equal. So a kid can go to, kids will think that if they don't get into McMaster for science,
right,
they're not going to be a doctor.
Right.
And, you can very well go somewhere like Trent in Peterborough that doesn't have a ton of students. You can get a science degree and you can still go to McMaster. It doesn't have to, and kids have this belief that like if they make one mistake over the course of high school, their life is over.
Right.
And that's completely irrational because that's not at all the reality, right? And
well, I thought I was making a mistake. I probably was making a mistake. I could have done academic level English. I was lazy and irresponsible. I had the capacity to do it. I always grew up doing well in school, but I got lazy. And so I took some academic courses. And then when it came to English, I just kind of called it in and took applied English. And there was classes I would sit in and I tell people this sometimes, I didn't really read a whole book until I graduated high school.
Right.
Like I actually didn't read till after high school. And now I read all the time. And now I've studied at pretty high levels compared to how I should have ended up turning out based on how I was doing in high school. I remember there was a class that you read us the book. People were like, oh, didn't you read books in high school? I'm like, no, my English teacher read us a book.
Yeah.
And they're like, what English class were you in? I was in applied English because I was just being lazy and irresponsible.
Oh, for sure.
But it's okay. I was able to turn that around. I was able to adapt. I was able to adjust. I was able to make better decisions in the future. And my life isn't over because I took applied English and didn't do that well at it. Right.
And this is a big conversation right now where, so in Peel, we're going back to, in certain schools, we're going back to de-streaming grade 9. Okay. So there's been, I don't know if you heard about the ministry report, but there was a ministry report that looked at systemic racism within our board. So we found that kids were being streamed into courses that didn't necessarily fit their ability because people had preconceived notions about those kids. So we're moving towards de-streaming math and English in grade 9, and some parents are really freaked out by that idea, right? But we've had kids who didn't finish high school who then went back as adults and are very successful now, and they have university degrees, but this idea of a false timeline where this has to happen by this. It's kind of like when you have new parents, right? Like you have a young child, and you'll talk to other parents and they'll be like, "Oh, well, we're really concerned because Johnny's not walking yet, but he's 36 weeks old." Like how someone read in a book that this should happen by this time. Right. My daughter, from the time she was 4, read really, really well and read really, really fast. My son, he doesn't read as well as my daughter did. But when you have conversations, you can tell that that's just something he's not as good at as his sister was, but there's nothing wrong with him. Right. But I think a lot of parents and a lot of kids have this idea that they have to achieve this by this date or it's over. And it's not really like that, right? Like it's not like hockey where if you don't make the OHL when you're 15, you're not going to the show. Right. It's academics. It's different. Like I still take courses at university on occasion now. Right. You can turn that around. I tell people all the time. Right. You can get into most schools as a mature student with terrible marks as a high school student. Because they're, And I think I was talking about my brother who lives in Winnipeg, and he intentionally didn't finish high school. So he had 29 credits and intentionally didn't get his 30th as a way of sticking it to the man. Right? So then my brother, now he worked at BlackBerry and he worked at a really high level writing code, and now he does IT for the city of Winnipeg. Like he does really well and he's a really, really smart guy, but he didn't finish high school. So it is possible to do things in a non-traditional manner and things will still work out. So if you are doing things traditionally and you got an 85, heaven forbid, your life isn't over because you didn't get a 90. And that's kind of the irrational anxiety that kids have, is this idea that if I don't achieve this by this, my whole life is over. What would your advice be to parents then? I think in general, take a step back, right? A lot of the kids who are super anxious, the reason why they're anxious is because their parents have decided their career path for them. Right. So, we'll have kids who will say, well, I hear a lot where I can't bring an 85 home to my parents because they'll be upset. And I had an interview at Meadowvale with a parent years ago where the kid had a 96 and the father looked me in the eyes and said, well, how can she make up those 4 marks that she lost? And I was like, English isn't like that. Like, it's not like a test-based subject where you can get, There's a reason why professional writers have armies of editors. Even a professional writer doesn't write perfect, right? Almost no one can write perfect. So when a kid is pulling a 96, you want the parent to celebrate and throw a party and get an ice cream cake because the kid got a 96, and then to have the parent stare in the eyes and say, how can she earn back those 4 marks? It starts to make sense why the kid's super anxious, right? So, and I get it as a parent. Like I said, I have 2 kids and it's scary. You want the best for your kids for sure. But I think sometimes parents have kind of unrealistic expectations. It's like when I coached football and I coached, varsity football, and you'd have a dad who would say, well, my son's going to be a quarterback. And I'd be like, well, your kid can't run and they can't throw. So I don't think that's really going to happen. But the father would delusionally tell you that their son was going Division I. You know, with baseball too, I imagine.
Yeah.
Kids who their parents decide that kid's going D1 and he's going to play in the bigs.
Yeah.
And then you see the kid play and you're like, just let him be happy. You
right.
know? Like,
let him enjoy the sport.
Be happy he made the team. He's one of 35 kids in the region who made a really tough team to make, right? So I think for parents, part of it is obviously you want to make sure your kid's making good choices. But I think at some point, you have to sort of step back and say, okay, I did my best. I taught this kid right from wrong. I taught them how to work hard. It's going to work out or it's not, right? And I think that's part of like letting go and letting them leave the nest a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So.
Speaking of letting them leave the nest, young adults are also struggling with this more now than ever. And I'm connected to a lot of them who, you know, they're coming out of high school, they're finishing up their university degrees, and they're anxious as ever about starting their life and then feeling totally shamed about being behind in life because they don't already live on their own, or they don't have the job they expected to get right out of university, or they still live at their parents' house and, you know, culture's making fun of them for being a millennial who lives in their mom's basement kind of thing. And like, they're just feeling like garbage about themselves. They're being anxious. They feel like they're missing out on life. They feel like they're not going to get married at some point. They're not going to have a family. They're just not going to be good enough. They're going to miss the mark. They're never going to get the job they want. Like, they're all wrestling with that.
Right.
It's coming from their upbringing and their experience in high school, and it's feeding into young adulthood. What advice would you give young adults who have felt that way, experienced that anxiety in high school, wrestled with that in university, did relatively well, and now they're actually having to do real life and succeed in the real world, and they're feeling like, oh, I can't just do my homework and get a 99 anymore, and I'm not getting 99s in life
the real
right
world
now.
Yeah.
What do I do with my life?
Well, I think that's a thing too, right? Like, we rarely get report cards in the real world, right? Like every 5 years, someone comes into my classroom and watches me teach for half an hour and they go, yeah, okay, no one's dying. You're doing all right. Right. Like we don't have that. And a lot of that sort of perceived value that we have about ourselves comes from ourselves. Right. So, I mean, we were talking about houses, and economically, your generation is in a very weird spot compared to even where my generation was, right? So if you look at the demographics, I'm a Gen Xer, and there were hardly any of us.
Right.
Our parents were baby boomers, and, you know, they really were convinced that the world revolved around them, and we were latchkey kids, and, you know, we grew up on craft dinner that we made ourselves, and we were encouraged not to burn the house down, and that was the extent of the parenting that we received, right? Your generation, you had, for the most part, fairly good parents. But if you look at the numbers, you're the second largest group of people, and the baby boomers are still alive, and they're the first biggest group of people. So they're still holding on to jobs that traditionally your generation would have got. And they're active. I mean, my in-laws are in their 70s, and they're not like 70-year-olds were 20 years ago.
Right.
They're still incredibly active. They can make it up the stairs with no problem. So the idea was before your parents would go into a little apartment or they'd downsize into a home or whatever, and you'd get their house. That's not happening now. Even for my generation, our parents still live in their homes and they still go to work. Right. So it makes it more difficult for your generation for sure. And I think the biggest thing for young adults starting out right now is just sort of trust the process, right? And I didn't expect when I graduated university to have the same house that my parents had because they'd been in the game for years. Right. And I was coming into it. And I think right now when I talk to young people, there's a lot of people who think that they should have 4 bedrooms and a backyard with a fence, and they should be the manager immediately at their job. And like it's not that it's an unwillingness to pay your dues. It's just the world is different now, and your dues take a little bit longer to pay, right? And we were talking about the idea that for the most part here, in Canada, if you show up on time, you're going to at least have a roof and food, right? Right. For most people. Yeah. Obviously, there's, you know, things that can make that not happen, but for the most part, you're safe, right? And that's a huge luxury that we have compared to people in the rest of the world, where we're basically safe. So I think even if you have to live in your mom and dad's basement, you know, be as independent as you can in that situation, and, you know, do things that make you feel worthy of being an adult, and don't act like you're 16 years old and living in your mom's basement. Right. Like, be a grown up.
You can be a 24-year-old and act like a 24-year-old while living at your parents' house.
Absolutely, right? And I think some people forget that. Like, I know guys who are my age who still live with their parents. And I'm like, bro, your mom probably shouldn't have to do your laundry. You're 40 years old and you have 2 kids that live with their mom. Like, you should probably be a grown up at this point in the game, right? So I think if you look at it like Pete Davidson from Saturday Night Live always jokes that his mom's his roommate because he lives in his mom's basement, right? Well, Pete Davidson obviously has the financial means to have his own place. He's chosen to live with his mother, and he acts like him and his mom are roommates. So I'm not saying that you should strut around your parents' house like you're their roommate.
Right.
But you're responsible for something. If you bring a little bit to the table, maybe make sure that you grab some groceries or help with a bill and do things that make you feel like an adult, even though you don't own your own property.
And that's not you being so nice and kind and generous. That's you actually, it helps you by doing that. You feel empowered. You feel confident. That anxiety, like a lot of anxiety is unavoidable. It's part of your upbringing. It's part of your experience. It's embedded into you. You wrestle with, some people wrestle with more than others, but a lot of anxiety that we experience is imposed on ourselves by our poor choices, by the things that we're doing that aren't really helping ourselves, by our laziness and our irresponsibility and all that kind of stuff. You can help that.
Yeah, I talk to kids a lot about post-secondary because kids are very afraid about incurring debt to go to post-secondary. And I try to get them to understand that even if you go to school for something that you end up not doing, that's not really that bad, right? So when I walked away from university, I was OSAP to the hill. I had the OSAP full ride.
Yeah.
So I owed a lot of money when I finished university, which was why I went and taught in the Northwest Territories, because I needed to pay back bills. But I think when I think about the really valuable lessons I learned at university, it was things like, how do you stretch a 6-pack of tuna?
Right.
How do you make sure the lights stay on, right? Those were the important lessons. It wasn't so much, this 3rd-year history course that I took or a 2nd-year English course I took. Those weren't the important lessons. It was learning how to be a grown-up, right?
Yeah.
Like, I owe a ton of money on my phone bill. I don't have a ton of money coming in. I need to figure that out, right? And I think that's kind of what we're missing is that learning how to be an adult. And I think our parents want to nurture us as much as they can usually, right? So if we are staying with, moms are moms. And
they are.
They're going to try to nurture you when you're staying at their house. I think it's hard to learn those important lessons. And what I always will say to kids is I'm like, okay, so you go to university and maybe you owe 40 grand, but what's the first thing you're going to buy when you're done university? And they're like, well, I'm going to work to buy a house. And I'm like, right. So with a house, you're incurring hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt immediately. Like if I have a $500,000 mortgage, a $540,000 dollar debt isn't that much different from a $500,000 debt. So it's not that big of a deal if you have to go into debt to pay for school, because part of being an adult is managing debt, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I mean, for your generation, it's $1 million mortgage.
That's I was gonna say. Wait, $500,000 mortgages?
Right?
Where are you living?
That's a deal.
That's a condo.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get that. That's good, and that definitely, that advice helps with the anxiety, right? If you can start to think of it a little bit differently, you can start to tell yourself these things. You can start to make it through each day. Take small steps every single day, and that's going to help with the anxiety that you're feeling.
I think I just had a kind of a thought, and I thought about when I was talking about the concussions that I'd had. So after those 5 rapid concussions, I went into kind of a depression anxiety spiral. And the way that I got out of that was through positive self-talk, right? Where you're saying to yourself, things aren't really so bad. And I was talking to someone about this the other day. When I was in that cycle of anxiety and depression, I made a conscious decision that I was going to find one thing to celebrate each day. And some days it would be time for bed and I hadn't found that one thing. So I'd go drink a glass of cold milk because I love a glass of cold. And I'm like, that's it. That was my one good thing for the day. But I found that when I forced myself to acknowledge good things in my life, then I started to notice 3 good things and 4 good things and 5 good things. And I'm by no means saying that that's how you cure depression, because it's a real thing, right? But for me personally, that being able to talk myself sort of down was a way to put the brakes on my anxiety and my depression. So I think reminding yourself that you're okay and you're safe and you're fine is a good way to deal with some of that anxiety. And
what I want to push into a little bit is, and this is actually connecting a little bit to our Unity series that we're doing here at the church, that one of the conversations I was going to have that I wasn't able to have yet, I'd like to have at some point, but it was with somebody I knew from school, and somebody I interacted with from junior high and in senior high, and now re-interacted with them as an adult. And they're really wrestling with things, and part of their wrestling is just part of their life was a challenge growing up compared to mine. They didn't have the privilege I had, basically. What didn't help with that was the way that people who had privilege like me treated them.
For sure.
Right? And so we're talking about bullying here. And I was, obviously you all grow up, hopefully you grow up in your 20s and you go, being mean to people is ridiculous and silly and absurd. Now, obviously, you don't understand that when you're a kid.
Sure.
You don't understand the impact of your words. you grow up, you become an adult, and you go, yeah, don't be a bully, don't be mean. When you face it head on, when you come face to face with somebody whose life you have compassion for and you have empathy for, because their life isn't anywhere close to the life that you're able to live and isn't secure, and they're not surrounded by love and community like you are, and they're struggling every single day. And then you start to think about, oh my gosh, like part of that's because of how I treated them.
Right.
It blew me away how I felt. I was like, whoa, like it's not just passive, like, yeah, I shouldn't have been mean.
No.
It's like
it's life altering.
This altered this guy's life.
Yeah.
I don't think about it. This altered his life, and rightfully or wrongfully, he attributes some of the difficulties he has to, jokes I would have made.
For sure.
Or throwing a dodgeball really hard. You know what I mean? Things that I would have thought are nothing. So why don't you speak to, for people who are in high school, who are at a high school, some of the effects that you've seen over the years of bullying or just slight mistreatment or just little mean words or over aggression in certain areas, and the actual real life impact that you've seen that have on some people, so people can really get a picture of the impact of things that they do when they're younger and the things that they say when they're younger have a real impact on people in their future, right? And maybe be more conscious of it. Yeah,
and I think for me, I first became conscious of it when I moved, when I was a kid. So when I was little, I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie in Northern Ontario. No one had money. The steel plant was doing poorly. Everyone's dad was laid off, and we were all kind of in the same boat. And then as a result of that, my dad moved to Southern Ontario because there was a job at the Toyota plant in Cambridge that paid better than the job he didn't have anymore at the steel plant. So I ended up going to a school where kids had a lot more privilege than I did. And I remember on one of my first days, I got made fun of because I didn't have tree torn or bass loafers and because I didn't have any polo shirts. And the school that I came from, if you wore a pink shirt with a horse on it, you were going to get beat up, right?
Yeah.
So when I came to this school in Southern Ontario and the kids had a lot more privilege than I had, that was an eye-opener for me. And then looking at it now as an adult and figuring out that I had tons of privilege compared to a lot of people that I grew up with, despite my perception that I didn't at that moment in time, that's been huge. And talking to friends that are my age who are in their 40s who still are trying to navigate the world and, like you said, had been bullied when they were younger, right? And that's it does definitely have a really negative effect on people. And I think what you end up with is, people who harbor anger that they don't know how to deal with, right? And how toxic that is. And then the other side of that coin is I think I've experienced kids who thought they had the world by the horns and were jerks to everybody else because they were, the kids who were born on third base and thought they hit a triple, you know what I mean, right?
And everyone in school treated them like they hit a triple.
Right. And then when they get to be an adult and they figure out that no one cares what kind of car your dad drove, right, that's really hard for them. And I think that it's that toxicity that goes with either being subjected to like torment as a kid or being the person that torments people. That's not healthy. It's toxic, right? So on both ends of it, I can see I've encountered kids who've been bullied relentlessly and it's so hard for them. And then I've also seen kids who were awful people when they were children, and then as adults, they're kind of being punished for the way that they were as a kid because they're so ill-equipped to deal with the world when they're not the center of attention, right? So, yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things that we've worked on forever in school is these initiatives to end bullying, and I feel like we're in a better place than we were when you were in school, and we're definitely in a better place than when I was in school. But it's still a thing that happens, and I think when we look at social media, right, is a huge thing around it too, where kids put, you don't want to blame the victim, but kids unknowingly put themselves in positions where other kids, like if I was watching the YouTube video of, do you remember Star Wars Kid?
No.
Okay, so there was like a viral video where this kid is swinging around a mop and thinks nobody's watching.
Right.
And then people found the video and it got posted and it went viral. And then he came out as an adult and was like, that was horrible. Like I got made fun of relentlessly for it. So we watch a YouTube video and we think this is hilarious. This kid thinks he's on Star Wars, not understanding that kid who's the victim of that, it's awful. Right? It does absolutely hurt people. And I think one of the good things, we have this whole, we say to kids, it'll get better. Yeah. And I think for the most part it can, but we shouldn't assume that it automatically will. Right. So I know kids who are, your age or older who it hasn't really gotten better for them. Yeah. They were really, really hurt by the things that happened to them as a child. And for whatever reason, there's kids who can deal with it and they bounce back and they're fine. And there's kids who can't, right? One of the things I've noticed as a teacher is, I've taught kids who are child soldiers. So they've seen horrific things. They've had to do horrific things. And you see them operate as adults and they're fine. They seem fine, right? And you have other kids who, when they're in grade 11, their parents get divorced and it's a life-changing thing.
Yeah.
So you never really know how someone is equipped to deal with things when you're subjecting someone else to things that are mean, right?
Yeah.
And I've never understood the payoff of, hurting other people. And I think one of the things that we fail to recognize when we're looking at bullying is that usually the person that's being the aggressor has some kind of deep insecurity that's like, even when we look at things like racism, right? Usually if someone's incredibly racist, they're deeply insecure about who they are as a person.
Yeah. Or they're afraid of something irrationally.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have this idea that we're projecting strength, but we're not, right? Because you're really making yourself look weak when you're targeting someone who, like if I was a wolf and I only attacked the deer who had a broken leg, like I'm not sure the other wolves are gonna be like, yeah, good job, Jimmy, you're the toughest wolf,
sure,
right? And I think as a society, we need to acknowledge that when we project bullying and just that meanness, we're projecting weakness. We're not projecting strength. And I think historically, when you watch movies from the 80s, for example, and you see the bully kind of put up on a pedestal, I think societally we've sort of shifted, but I think there's still a lot of work to do around this idea that there's nothing cool about being mean to people, especially people who aren't in a position to defend themselves, right? So I don't know if that really looked at bullying necessarily, but it's...
No, it does. And when I was processing this, I was thinking like when I was in high school, I was like a relatively decent kid. I don't remember. You can probably say otherwise. Like I don't know, but I thought of myself as like I'm a decent kid. I have a good group of friends. I felt relatively secure. I succeeded at the things I wanted to do. I was a part of a church, and I was trying to like be a good person. And every single week, people were saying, "Hey, like this is how you live." And there was still something natural in me to, take a shot here just in the name of humor maybe, or to throw a ball extra hard because you want to impress somebody or whatever, you don't think anything of it. And then when you would talk about bullying, like it kind of was like over the head. It's I'm not a bully, right? Or well, that's a little bit silly, or it's kind of, seems lame. But I
think the thing that happens with high school too is you only have that one mandatory gym class that you have to have in grade 9, right? So you talk about like, the dodgeball, and for, I was athletic, you're athletic. When you go and you're playing dodgeball in grade 9, the kids that you can just pepper with dodgeballs, and you're like, whatever, I'm going to hit this kid with a dodgeball because I got a good arm.
Right.
And you don't understand that gym for that kid is way different than gym class was for you, right? As someone who's relatively athletic, you go to gym class and you're playing floor hockey, you're playing basketball, it's all fun. But for the kid that struggles, gym class is a nightmare. And I never really understood that until I started talking to my daughter about gym class. And not that my daughter isn't a good athlete, but she's not interested in sports, right? So when I was a kid, I loved gym class. It was the
filled
great,
you up, right?
It was fantastic.
There's where all my confidence comes back from, succeeding in my gym class.
And then my daughter's telling me stories about getting hit by a lacrosse ball because this little weasel in her class thinks it's fun to pepper kids with lacrosse balls, right? So you kind of look at it differently. You're like, wow, was I, like you're saying, did I need to throw that dodgeball that hard, right? Yeah. And I think like, we can't go back in time and undo those things, but I think it's just understanding that even though we might see ourselves as a good person, not everybody's going to always see us as a good person, and being okay with that, right? And trying to always be better than you were the day before, right?
Yeah. One of the things that was profound to me, and we'll wrap it up on this, but I want to get your thoughts on it, and maybe if you have something that you can say to people who are listening that is actually going to click for them, especially if they're a student still. One of the things that was profound to me after I got out of high school was how the social dynamics that I'm experiencing in high school were so real. Like, the hierarchy was so real. And somebody from the outside would be like, why do you treat that person that way and that person that way? Why do you feel that way? Why are you intimidated by that person? They're not that great. Why are you mean to that person? Whatever. But for you in it, it's so real. You know who's who. You feel the hierarchy. When you're at a high school and you're working with high school students, everyone's a joke to you because they're all children, right? And you look back and to what's real for a high school student and like the social hierarchy and, oh, well, that guy's this guy. To you as an adult, you're like,
it's ridiculous.
You're all the same. There's no difference between you, but it's still real to them. So wrestling with like, how do I balance the tension of, the truth is that some of these kind of imbalances or hierarchy things or the social dynamics aren't real.
Right.
Like they're not they don't matter as much, right? Like, and you want to make sure students know, like, look, that doesn't matter. You're going to grow up and everything's going to be different. At the same time as being attentive to the fact that it is very real. It's the most real thing to them.
For sure. And I think that's hard for adults, right? Is not understanding that when we look at the struggles that our kids go through, it's very easy to be like, this is ridiculous. Why do you care what that person thinks about you? But for the kid in that moment, that's a huge deal, right? And I'm thinking there was a group of girls that I went to high school with who all had the same first name. And I'm not going to say the name just in case, right?
Becky.
But
Jessica.
We'll call them Becky's for now, but they weren't Becky's. Anyhow, there were 4 girls who all had the same first name, and they were really good friends. And they were very popular, and they were kind of the princesses of my high school. And they all dated hockey players who were 2 years older than them. And then they all went to the same university, and they would literally like pick their classes together so they were in the same class. And now they all live in the same neighborhood. But the thing that's really interesting about it is in grade 11, these girls really seemed like they were something important, right? But to think that you went to university and you didn't actually study what you're interested in, you studied what your 3 friends were interested in, and then you didn't buy a house that you really thought was a great house. You bought a house because of the proximity to the girl that you've been friends with in grade 9. You realize as an adult how many experiences these girls missed out on, right? Because they created this little insulated safe space for themselves where they didn't ever have to be challenged, and how much of a letdown it is to think that, you know, a lot of times those bad things that we experience are the things that make us strong enough to deal with the great stuff that we're going to have later in life, and how limiting it is to try to maintain the false hierarchy of high school. And I think for kids that are in high school, when you're in high school, those 4 years or 5 years seems like the longest time ever. But like we were talking about, like how fast 10 years go when you're a grown up, right? And
I've been out of high school for 12 years. Well, 12 years is 2021, isn't it? I graduated 2009.
And I always joke that I've been in high school for 24 years, right? So it's nuts. But and I think even though those things are super important in the moment, high school ends. And when you're an adult, like you said, nobody cares. And when I think of the thousands of kids that I went to high school with, there's maybe 3 that I still have somewhat regular contact with, right? So even though that seems like it's the worst possible place if it's going bad, or it feels like it's the greatest place in the world if it's going good, it ends. And you have to be ready to deal with the realities of life after high school, because even though it feels important, it's really not in the grand scheme of things, right? So
no, that's helpful. Well, Mr. Becker, Lee Becker, thank you for being here. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for your blessing our community by just sharing some of your insights, some of your advice. You came in, you gave us your time generously, and we appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's also important that you know that Renewed Church, one of the locations is actually used to meet at Edenwood Middle School. And so a lot of the families are right in the area of Meadowville.
In our neighborhood,
and you're a pretty well-known person, and people honor and respect you.
Well,
and people have had conversations about Mr. Becker at Meadowville Secondary School and the impact that you've had and the influence you've had on their lives, either as their teacher or as the teacher that they knew and they wished they had a class with. And so you have a legacy in Meadowville that you may not realize, that people outside, especially because you don't live in Meadowville.
Right. No, I live in Kitchener. Yeah. Well, I visit Meadowville.
And people honor you and respect you. And it's because of the work you're doing and the way that you posture yourself in your teaching role, and how much care you actually give to your role as a teacher, and that it's not just a job to you. You actually want to make real impact. So.
And I want to shout out a teacher named Wally Gangle. So when I was in high school, my plan did not involve post-secondary, and it definitely did not involve being a teacher. And I had a teacher in high school named Wally Gangle, who basically forced me to teach a lesson in grade 9 history about the Schlieffen Plan, and made me teach it, and then basically said to me, like, this is what you're going to do. And that ended up being what I did.
Wow.
When I was 17, I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do now, and that's what I've done. So everything that I do as a teacher, I try to honor those 3 or 4 teachers that were really instrumental, because my high school years weren't great, and there was a lot of stuff going on in my house that was chaotic. And being able to have someone who said, you're good enough to do this, was huge for me at that moment. So I always I want kids to know that you're good enough to do something that you can be proud of and hang your hat on. And, and there are people that see you, right? So like we talked about, kids adding me on Facebook or being on Instagram and seeing, I see the things that kids do. And every chance I get, I'll say to kids, hey, I'm super proud of you. Like, you're doing great as an adult. And yeah, like I think to me, I got into this business because a teacher told me I had to.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And, I think it's just important to understand that we see you, like your teachers see what you're doing as adults, and we're proud of you. And
And it probably makes you pretty humble, thinking the power of your words
Sure.
could be as powerful as his words towards
For
somebody.
sure.
And they are.
For sure.
So that's a major responsibility.
Yeah.
To think of it that way is so wise.
Yeah, and I try to keep that in mind. Now, it's not that you get more wise as you get older, but you definitely get reflective.
Well, hopefully
right?
you do.
Right, you should. Right, but I don't want to pretend like I'm Johnny
Sure.
Wisdom, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, you get time to reflect on decisions you made, and you kick yourself for the bad ones, and you kind of give yourself a pat on the back for the good ones. But yeah, I'm very thankful to have been able to spend my entire career up to this point basically at Meadowvale, right?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a part of the community for
You
sure.
are. You really are. Well, I just want to say, if you're watching this right now and you're in high school, give your teacher some honor and respect because they're working really hard. They genuinely care, and it's not easy the role they're doing, especially navigating these difficult times through the COVID season that we're all in. If you're a parent of a high school student or just a student in general, you need to treat your teachers as though they are a human being who deserves equal love and respect and honor because they're doing a significant job and role in the life of your students. And I know you want what's best for your student, and that's good and that's right, and they do too. And they want to have open dialogue with you about how to achieve that. But you need to think of them as somebody who's on your side and treat them like that with honor and respect. And if you're someone who's kind of just out of high school, you're kind of in your young adult years and you're fluttering along, or you're just kind of feeling a little bit aimless, I encourage you, if you're able to, reach out to one of your teachers and have a conversation with them, because I guarantee that they remember you and that they care about you and they care about how you're doing, and they might have some advice and wisdom for you in your young adult years that they weren't able to give you when you were a teenager because you weren't listening. But now that you're around, they can sit down and talk with you or just reach out and chat or encourage you. And so feel free to do that. I think it'd be an excellent, really enriching experience both for you, and your teachers. So thank you for doing this.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
It's really cool to do
Thanks
this.
for turning out too, right? Like that's the thing that I'm always thankful when I see kids who turned out and they're good adults, right? It's fantastic.
I appreciate that.
So thank you for turning out.
Yeah, I'm doing my best. Still turning, I guess. Awesome. Thanks, Mr. Becker.
No problem.
We'll
My
see you guys
pleasure.
another time.